Hello children, I am Sunil Kumar Pandey, your English teacher from Cambridge International School, Dasuya. In this video, I am going to discuss with you chapter 7 of your textbook Flamingo, the interview by Christopher Sylvester. The chapter is divided into two parts. Part 1 is a general discussion on interviews and part 2 is an excerpt from an actual interview. We will begin with part 1. But before we begin, let's first consider what an interview is. To most of us, the word interview brings up images of a prospective employer asking questions of a candidate before giving them a job in their organization. That is a job interview. But that is not what is meant here. Here we are concerned with journalistic interviews. Now, journalistic interviews also have the same structure. But the person who asks questions here is a journalist, and the person who answers the questions is either a politician or a government official or any other celebrity. The purpose is also not to give job. The purpose is either to get some information or to elicit the opinions and ideas of the interviewee. The output is either a news report containing that information or a reproduction of the whole interview to be published in a newspaper or a magazine. This chapter is basically concerned with interviews that are published in newspapers or magazines, not the ones that appear in the electronic media, especially the TV. So, let's read part 1 and find out what it says about the interviews. Line 1. Since its invention a little over 130 years ago, the interview has become a commonplace of journalism. Commonplace of journalism means a common practice in journalism. Today, almost everybody who is literate will have read an interview at some point in their lives. While from the other point of view, several thousand celebrities have been interviewed over the years, some of them repeatedly. Interviews are so commonplace now that anyone who reads newspapers or magazines must have read at least one or more interviews. And also, celebrities, famous celebrities, would have given interviews at some point in their lives, some of them more than one. So it is hardly surprising that opinions of the interview, of its functions, methods and merits vary considerably. There are differences of opinion among people regarding interviews, the functions of interviews, the methods of interviews, the merits and demerits of interviews. Some might make quite extravagant claims for it as being in its highest form a source of truth and in its practice an art. On the one hand, there are people who are very vociferous supporters of interviews. They say in its pure form it is a source of truth and its practice is a form of art. Others, usually celebrities who see themselves as its victims, might despise the interview as an unwarranted intrusion into their lives or feel that it somehow diminishes them. On the other hand, the opponents of interviews, and mostly celebrities who have already become famous, and those who do not like to be interviewed now. It's remarkable that almost everyone before they become famous wants to be interviewed, wants their interviews to be published. However, once they become famous, they see themselves as a victim of interviews because they think that their views are being distorted by the interviewers. So these people often call interviews as an unwelcome interference in their lives, or some even feel that it somehow diminishes them, reduces their stature, reduces their personality, takes away something from their personality. And the writer gives a very interesting example to compare this. Just as in some primitive cultures, in some tribal societies, it is believed that if one takes a photographic portrait of somebody, then one is stealing that person's soul. In some primitive cultures, people are so backward, they don't actually know about photography. So when someone takes their photo and shows it to them, they are surprised that their image appears on that photographic plate, and they somehow come to believe that their soul has been taken out from their body by the photographer. In the same way, these celebrities who consider themselves as victims of interviews feel that some part of their personality has been, or some part of their soul has been taken out by the interviewers. They are so opposed to it. After this, the writer quotes some celebrities who did not like being interviewed, and they have said several things against interviews. The first of them is B.S. Naipaul, a famous British Indian author, also a Nobel Prize awardee in literature. V.S. Naipaul feels that some people are wounded by interviews. They are actually injured by interviews and lose a part of themselves, lose a part of their persons. Lewis Carroll, on the other hand, the creator of Alice in Wonderland, was said to have had a just horror of the interviewer. That means he was said to have been frightened of the interviewers. He hated interviews so much. He feared interviews so much. And he never consented to be interviewed. He never agreed to be interviewed. It was his horror of being lionized which made him thus repel would-be acquaintances, interviewers, and the persistent petitioners for his autograph. However, in his case, fear was actually fear of being lionized. Lionized, portray as lion. That means give undue publicity. In Lewis Carroll's case, he was frightened of the prospect of being given undue publicity, and this is why he would keep away from would-be acquaintances, would-be friends or interviewers, or also persistent petitioners for autograph, people who sought his autographs. He would often keep himself away from them. And he would afterwards relate the stories of his success in alienating all such people with much satisfaction and amusement. And after turning away some of these people, he would, with great pride and satisfaction, tell the story of how he turned away those people. He would tell these stories to others. Okay. Another example, Rudyard Kipling, the author of Jungle Books. expressed an even more condemnatory attitude towards the interviewer. Condemnatory, looking down upon. Derogatory attitude towards the interviewer. How do we know this? Through the words of his wife. His wife, Caroline, writes in her diary for 14th October 1892 that their day was wrecked, spoiled by two reporters from Boston. One day, two reporters came from Boston to interview Rudyard Kipling, and he was so perturbed because of this that his wife writes in her diary for the day that their day was wrecked, their day was spoiled because of them. She reports her husband as saying to the reporters, "Why do I refuse to be interviewed? Because it is immoral." He called interviews an immoral act, a morally wrong act. It is a crime, just as much of a crime as an offense against my person. He considered interviews to be as much a crime as a bodily attack. It is cowardly and vile. Taking interview is a cowardly act and an evil act, vile, evil. No respectable man would ask for it, and much less give it. No respectable person would like to take interview, and no respectable person would like to give interview. Okay, so far the writer gave us derogatory views on interviews expressed by some famous personalities. Now he points out a contradiction. These famous people despised interviews in this way. But what? Yet Kipling had himself perpetrated such an assault on Mark Twain only a few years before. Rudyard Kipling, who considered interviews to be equivalent to bodily attack, had carried out precisely such an attack on Mark Twain only a few years before. That means Rudyard Kipling had himself interviewed Mark Twain only a few years before. Then H.G. Wells, the famous writer of science fictions, in an interview in 1894 referred to the interviewing ordeal. H.G. Wells called appearing for interviews or giving interviews a tortuous process, an ordeal, but was a fairly frequent interviewee. However, he had given interviews very, very frequently, and 40 years later found himself interviewing Joseph Stalin, and 40 years later he himself interviewed Joseph Stalin, the famous ruler of Soviet Russia. Then Saul Bellow, another famous author, who has consented to be interviewed on several occasions, nevertheless once described interviews as being like thumbprints on his windpipe. Before we understand the meaning of the phrase thumbprints on his windpipe, let's just assume that this is another derogatory phrase for the interviews. So Saul Bellow, who also had derogatory views about interviews, had himself agreed to be interviewed on several occasions. So here the writer brings out the hypocrisy in the attitude of these famous personalities. He points out that before becoming famous, and even after becoming famous in many cases, they had readily sought to be interviewed. They wanted to be interviewed in order to be famous. And they also took interviews of several other famous personalities. Nonetheless, at one point in their life, they criticized interviews as immoral act, as crime, and so on. So this is nothing but hypocrisy. If they really considered interviews an immoral act or a crime, then they should not have committed that crime. They should not have agreed to give interview in the first place, and they should not have taken others' interviews. So all the writer does so far is to point out that the celebrities, the famous personalities who see themselves as victims of interviews and criticize interviews are nothing but hypocrites. Now let's consider the meaning of this phrase. Thumbprints on windpipe, a phrase used for interviews by Saul Bellow. What does it mean? Thumbprint on windpipe. In most of the guidebooks, you will find the meaning of this phrase as a suffocating experience, something that suffocates. But have a closer look, and then you will find that this meaning is not satisfactory. The purpose of an interviewer in an interviewee is to, let's leave it. First consider, in a suffocating experience, the person will not be able to, the interviewee will not be able to speak. If you are suffocated, you would not be able to speak. So if an interview is a suffocating experience for a celebrity, they would not be able to speak. However, the purpose of an interviewer is exactly the opposite. The purpose of an interviewer is to make the interviewee speak as much as possible. So how can he make the interview a suffocating experience? It would be counterproductive for him. If the interviewee is speaking as much as possible, it cannot be a suffocating experience for them. So obviously this is a misinterpretation. So what is the correct meaning of the phrase thumbprints on windpipe? Let's consider what are thumbprints. I would like to remind you, illiterate people who cannot sign their names put their thumbprints on documents. That thumbprint is unique to them. That is their identity, a representative of their personality, which no one else can imitate. And windpipe is used to produce sounds. We speak through our windpipe. So if someone puts their thumbprint on my windpipe, what happens? My words are distorted. They don't express what I mean to say. They express what that person means to say who has put this thumbprint on my windpipe. That means my words are interpreted in a way to serve the interviewer's interest. In other words, the words of the interviewees are distorted by the interviews in their own interest. Now, this is a very common complaint by famous people that they actually did not say or did not mean what they have been quoted as saying in an interview. So what happens? They say something and those same words are portrayed in a manner by the interviewer that their meaning is changed. This is the meaning of thumbprints on windpipe, a willful distortion of the words of the interviewee. At this point, let's consider a few interesting examples before we finish this today's session. Let me make it clear that the examples given by me do not represent my political ideology. They are just meant to illustrate. A few years ago, our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, was quoted as saying that he would put rupees 15 lakh in every Indian's account. On the other hand, the actual video in which he said these words, in that video he had said that if all the black money from the Indians deposited abroad is brought back, then it would be sufficient to put rupees 15 lakh in every Indian's accounts. Now this is a different thing, and the promise that he would put rupees 15 lakh in every Indian's account is a different thing. But those words were interpreted in a different way. This is thumbprint, the interviewers or others' thumbprints on his windpipe. Another example. Again, a few 1 or 2 years ago, in an interview, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, the former Congress president, was asked a question, asked about his experience of a trip to Kailash Mansarovar. Before answering this question, he spotted some disturbance and paused to let it pass. However, people with vested interests stopped the video there, circulated the video on the social media, and portrayed it as his inability to speak on his experience in that particular trip. In other words, they tried to show that he had actually not made that trip or was unable to say anything on the trip. This is putting thumbprint on his windpipe. So I think I have made this point clear. Thumbprints on windpipe means willful distortion of the interviewee's words by the interviewer to serve their own interests. We pause here and we will continue with the later part in another video tomorrow. Thank you.